If you dabble the least bit in motorcycling history, you have heard of this complex and ambitious machine, built in 1955 to dominate 500cc Grand Prix racing. At its best, the V8 had the numbers to do it. In 1957, when Gilera and MV were making no more than 67 to 70 horsepower from their inline fours, the V8 could summon 80 crankshaft horsepower at just over 12,000 revolution per minute, a power level not reached again in GP racing for 10 years. It had staying power, being liquid-cooled at a time when every competitor was air-cooled. It was extremely fast-timed at 178 miles per hour at the 1957 Belgian GP, yet it never won a single Grand Prix, although fast on certain courses it DNFed often. The V8 was a classic case of an ambitious program whose development needs exceeded the resources of its creators. The list of such failures is long. Think of BRM V16 Grand Prix car engine of the 1950s, Honda's oval piston NR 500 of the 80s, Chrysler's IV2220 inverted V16 aircraft engine of 1944. The engineering problem is to advance the state-of-the-art by enough to win, but by no more than can be made ready for use in the time available. Guzzi 500cc single might win an occasional GP, but never a championship. Carcano knew that singles and twins were finished in 500. Horsepower is basically cylinder filling ability multiplied times revolution per minute. So if Guzzi built another 4-cylinder, it would confront all the development already completed by Gilera and MV. To make up for the opposition's experience in filling the cylinders of its 4s, any Guzzi challenger would have to be capable of higher revolution per minute. That in turn would require a greater number of smaller, higher revving cylinders. A 6 would be wide, and European tracks still based upon public roads in many cases emphasized top speed and aerodynamics. Increased width was unacceptable. Then a V8 only water could cool the rear cylinder bank, but sketches and estimates soon showed that such a V8 crankshaft would be less than 13.5 inches wide. Even adding 2 inches for the dry clutch and 2.5 inches for a water pump, the resulting package slid into a fairing an inch narrower than a modern Ducati V-Twins. Don't think of Guzzi as a quaint little European manufacturer quietly crafting oddities in a backwater. At the time, Guzzi had 800 machine tools on its production floor and was a major transportation producer. On staff were craftsmen in every specialty. The company had produced aircraft parts in the war and understood how to quickly push projects from paper to metal. The V8 engine is a beautiful object, and its details reveal Carcano's devotion to weight control. The magnesium unit crankcase is open on right and left, allowing the crank to be slid in sideways. The middle 3 of its 5 main bearings were then bolted up against main webs at the apex of the V. There are no separate cylinder blocks. A portion of the cylinder water jacket was formed as part of the crankcase, and the rest was cast as part of the cylinder heads. The outer main bearings were carried in right and left engine covers, which also supported the vertically stacked gearbox. The usual built-up crank is made by press-fitting crank pins into the flywheels, but pressed joints, even when assembled with tons of pressure, creep apart under high-frequency vibration. The Hearth assembly system consisted of radial face splines cut into one end of a hollow crank pin and into its mating flywheel. Once the one-piece connecting rod and its big end cage and rollers were in place, pin and flywheel were powerfully drawn against one another by a large internal bolt, whose threads in the pin were of different pitch from those in the flywheel. If this seems arcane, consider that the 2,800 cubic inch piston engines on Martin and Convair airliners of the 1950s had cranks built in the same way. To make the Hearth coupling strong enough, crank pin diameter had to increase by about 50% to 30 millimeters. This in turn resulted in a hefty assembly of 16 5mm conrod rollers and their cage. As a crank turns, the speed of a crank pin bearing varies as the rod swings forward and back around the wrist pin. There's the unique nature of the 500 class chassis and suspension solutions that work well in 250 and 350 racing may bring disaster in the 500 class, as Honda RC181 would reveal in 1966. MV, with years of 500 handling evolution behind them, amassed points while the Honda wobbled, punished its tires and suffered mechanical DNFs, 500 experience counts. Guzzi lacked it. Look at the fairing off photo to see how far back in the chassis the engine is. In that hard rubber era, engines were moved back to increase traction, but the real effect was to unweight the front, robbing it of tire damping, allowing high-speed weave to develop. Experience is expensive and takes time. Gilera in the early 50s had to swallow the embarrassment of seeing its new four-cylinder beaten again and again by single-cylinder Nortons. Gilera gave up cherished suspension ideas, stiffened its chassis, and developed its engine until the company dominated 500 racing. Beginning in 1948, this was a 5-year process.